It has been a week in which world events have reminded us once again of the awesome responsibilities that await whoever enters the White House in the aftermath of the coming election. In America, we'll ask our guests what advice they would give the incoming president. But we also have the one, and indeed the only vice presidential debate to chew over. Who won? And did anything that happened on that stage move the dial at all? Welcome to Talking Politics USA. Hello, there is just over a month to go until the US election, and the stakes could hardly be higher at home or abroad. The world is watching the escalating conflict in the Middle East after Iran launched missile strikes on Israel, with the White House warning that there will be severe consequences for Iran. Donald Trump, meanwhile, has accused the Democrats of leading us to the brink of World War III. Meanwhile, there's also been the first and indeed last vice presidential debate before voters have their say next month. It has been quite a week, and that's before we've thrown in the latest polling data. Now, to discuss all that and more, joining me from Washington are Heather Nauert, who served in Donald Trump's administration, Adam Hodge, a former advisor to both Presidents Biden and Obama, and our veteran correspondent, Robert Moore. Thanks so much, all three of you, for joining us. Let's start with the events in the Middle East. Adam and Heather, you've both advised administrations on foreign policy, so it's fascinating to have you here with us. And Robert, of course, you spent a long time covering the Middle East, as well as your many years covering US politics. So I just wanted to sort of begin with a kind of summary and then work out what you all made of it, and really particularly from you, Adam and Heather, how you might be advising an incoming president. I always understood that when President Obama handed over to Donald Trump, one of the things discussed in that handover was how close Iran wasn't or wasn't to getting nuclear weapons. I've just seen President Biden today saying he wouldn't favor an attack on Iran's nuclear sites. And yet, what Iran has done the last few days does, to a lot of people, look as if that gives Israel the chance to potentially take out some strategic sites, perhaps within Iran. So Heather, maybe we'll begin with you. What do you make of the situation, and what would you be advising an incoming president should and should not do at this point?
Sure. Well, starting with this, the world has not been this fragile since the days leading up to World War II. Iran and Israel is just one piece of it. We are seeing this finally play out full bore all across the world, in particular with Iran. Iran is not just a threat to Israel. It is a threat to the United States, to the UK, and every Western country around the world. We just happen to see Israel fighting Iran, really for the first time. And so the situation is very dangerous. Israel has a right to defend itself. The United States should come out with a full-throated message that we support Israel. The problem is that message is not believable because all that President Biden has said before is don't do it. And Iran obviously does not listen to him. So if President Trump were in office today, I think his policy, I worked for him at the State Department, running communications as a State Department spokesperson when we pulled out of the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal. That was the right decision actually to make because Iran was cheating on that deal. And that's one of the problems and difficulties in dealing with Iran. You're not dealing with an honest broker. So we pulled out under that, and we starved Iran of the cash that it uses to foment terror around the world, not just in Israel. And so the Biden administration right now should be employing sanctions. They should be utilizing the sanctions that are currently in place, where they're currently letting Iran get away with all kinds of spending, putting their money into the disastrous programs that are killing people around the world. So we've got to go back to a policy where Iran fears us rather than the kind of policy that we have today under Joe Biden.
Adam, what would you be telling incoming President Harris that she should do in these circumstances?
I think one of the big things is, and you've seen it from Joe Biden just over the last 24, 48 hours, he's really, positioned the U.S. forces to stand up with our ally. And so it is not an accident that of the hundreds of missiles that Iran launched at Israel, that there were virtually zero casualties in Israel and many of them were shot down by American forces and our allied forces in the region. All of that done with American support, and we'll also add with support from our friends in the UK as well. So he has convened the international community to come together. Just today, the G7 came together. Vice President Harris was in the Situation Room with President Biden. I think if she was president, I think she would do much of the same, convene the world leaders, make clear that we stand with Israel, that they have a right to defend themselves. And quite frankly, like, they have done a masterful job of defending themselves, in part because of the assets that the administration has put in the region to help them do so. There's no question that the threat posed by Iran continues to threaten, our allies in the region and here in the U.S. And so, trying to get the world to put on more sanctions to punish Iran for their actions is something that I think you'll see the administration pursue. It's certainly something that Kamala Harris has supported, and I think that's what I think right now the right approach to do is. I think the question that we have to ask ourselves is, how do we turn down the rhetoric and tone down the threat of wider regional war? That has to be the overall goal. That has to be what we try to achieve, because nobody's served by a wider war in the Middle East.
Robert, as I said, you covered the Middle East for many years. You've since, in more recent times, covered it from the angle of US politics. It seemed to me that Iran firing 200 ballistic missiles and not doing any damage actually makes it look rather impotent. But it does also give Israel this possibility of attacking anything within Iran, at least in the next few days and weeks, that it might have had its eye on for a while. How do you read this situation?
Well, I think the October surprise that we always talk about in American politics is here, and that October surprise is called global chaos. I mean, I think the danger is that we're not at the end point, we're not even at the middle point of this Middle East crisis. We know that there will be an Israeli response. We can assume that it might be somewhat calibrated as a response to the pleas of the Biden administration, which really does not want to see a kind of all-out Middle Eastern war in the 5 weeks left between now and election day. So, there is the possibility Israel will strike at sort of oil installations, but not at this point at their nuclear sites. That would seem to be somewhat calibrated. But then what does Iran do? So I think, in terms of the political calculus here, it always strikes me that this can play both ways. On the one hand, this would seem to validate Trump's core narrative that under the Biden-Harris administration, we're veering into kind of global chaos. But on the other hand, if you're an independent voter, still undecided, sitting somewhere, out in the Midwest and with young kids, would you really want at this moment Donald Trump to be in the Situation Room? So, I think both arguments kind of favor either party, depending on how you look at this global crisis. But yeah, I mean, I think Heather is right that there's real concern that now that Iran is kind of a rogue actor with little to lose and may well try and respond in kind to an Israeli retaliation. So these are dangerous times, and the political calculation incredibly complex here.
I would argue Iran has been a rogue actor for a very long time. Only now is the world and as a broader American audience paying close attention to it. Who's happy today that the United States is part of this and coordinating with Israel, and that are the Saudis and other partners in the region, because they have been experiencing all kinds of attacks in their own country, whether it's missiles or rockets or so forth on the airports, and others have been killed. It just doesn't get that much media attention. So Iran has been a bad actor for a very long time. Only now are we fully noticing it, is the broader world fully noticing
I agreed with that, but
yeah.
Before it was a bad actor with proxies, and those proxies could act for Iran. But now we haven't got those proxies, or at least they've been certainly...
But we always knew that it was at the heart of it.
Right. So now Tehran has to make the decision of a generation, really, of the decision that kind of we've been waiting for since 1979, really, and the Iranian Revolution is it prepared to go to war against what it calls the Zionist entity?
Heather, can I just ask you, and then I'll ask Adam the same question about Harris. What do you think changes, if anything, in terms of policy to Israel if Donald Trump wins? I mean, I'm assuming not very much. But the key point I would put to you is, clearly it has bothered the Biden-Harris administration the way in which Netanyahu doesn't seem to care very much, or if he does, doesn't pay any attention to what the White House might be feeling, for example, about the length of the war in Gaza, or for example, about the number of settlements being built in the West Bank, illegal settlements in the West Bank that seem to hamper the long-term chances of peace. What precisely, if anything, will change in a Trump White House on Israeli policy?
Yeah, first, I think Bibi doesn't have the luxury of caring so much about what the White House is saying now. Now, that may sound extreme, but it is the reality, because Israel's very existence is at stake, and Israel understands that. Now, when I worked with Secretary Pompeo, his first international trip was heading to Israel, where we met with Bibi Netanyahu, and we had those conversations and shared intelligence and talked about the threat of Iran, and talked about a nuclear program that they were building and developing right under our very noses. And so President Trump would be allied closely with Israel, making it very clear that we stand by Israel's right to defend itself. It is an existential threat to Israel, but not just to Israel. Let's not forget, America is the big Satan, whereas Israel is the little Satan. So I think you would see much closer cooperation. You would see the United States, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others meeting more regularly and having these conversations. What a lot of folks don't know is that there is a lot of intelligence sharing that goes on behind the scenes between our two governments. I don't believe that that level of intelligence sharing is taking place today when it is most important. Why? And that's because Israel right now can't really trust the United States. Yes, they get weapons from us. Yes, they get some intelligence from us. And as Adam correctly pointed out, our U.S. forces standing up in the region. However, that's not enough. So Israel feels like they can't wait around for the outcome of a U.S. presidential election, which could go either way. They need to act now.
Adam, I think back to the days when Robert was covering the events in Israel, and it seemed, frankly, a lot more hopeful time, at least a part of it. The idea of peace seemed a more realistic prospect. We're talking pre-Rabin's assassination and so on. And yet, look at where we are now. It has seemed to me that the Biden-Harris administration has been quite frustrated at times by the way in which Netanyahu doesn't appear to be listening to a lot of what they've got to say. Harris is not Biden. Different generation, different way of thinking about the problem. Do you think a President Harris would chart a different path in relation to Israel? Would she put on more pressure? Would she be prepared to go further if Israel wasn't doing what the US wanted? Or does she just accept, there's only so much influence you're ever going to exert over any Israeli administration?
Well, two things. I think one, there's certainly a case that, Vice President Harris talks pretty directly and bluntly with everybody that she meets with. And, when Netanyahu was here in Washington a few weeks ago, she was very clear what her views were on how Israel prosecutes the war in Gaza. Now, that's what, allies do. You talk openly and straight and bluntly with your friends, and you tell them what you think. But I think she's also been very clear. She will continue to support Israel's right to defend itself, and we will continue, as any country would if we were attacked, to support their ability to defend themselves. That's I think a non-starter. But how they go about it matters. And I think the other thing that's been kind of undercurrent over the last few weeks, you've seen some of these reports about whether there's some back channels between Netanyahu and his government and the Trump campaign and his administration. I think there's questions to be asked as to why or what, any efforts to undermine current U.S. foreign policy. I hope not, right? I hope that we can all, politics should stop at the water's edge, and we should be able to prosecute and have one foreign policy. We'll see how the next, 35 days unfolds in the war. I think bottom line, though, we all want to see tensions toned down in the region. We really are, no one is well served from a spiraling conflict in the Middle East, and everybody should do what they can to try to tone down the tensions and the violence.
Robert, can I just ask you, Adam, does this intersection of the Middle Eastern politics with your sort of knowledge of sort of the Democratic base, do you think that she has jeopardized now, fatally, the Arab American vote in Michigan? Is there any way that those uncommitted voters of Arab American heritage can back Harris, given that she is now backing Israel to the hilt?
Yeah, I think the political reality is that issue is not animating the campaign the way it was 5-6 months ago. I think because she has spoken openly about the plight of people in Gaza. And right, you watch it, you can't, from a human aspect, appreciate how people are, and she's talked openly and she's communicated effectively about what that is. But she's also been clear, under no circumstances, Israel is our ally. We will be there to defend them and help them defend themselves. We've done it the last 24 hours. We'll continue to do it. I think she doesn't worry about the politics necessarily of those uncommitted Democrats. I think she thinks she's going to win Michigan regardless, and she's going to do what she thinks is the right policy.
Okay, we need to move on to talk about the vice presidential debate, but I just want to close off this by asking you one very brief final question, Robert. I reference your time covering the Middle East. I remember that as a time when peace seemed a more realistic prospect. It's kind of all gone in one way since then, more settlements, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We have clearly seen American administrations trying to say to the Israelis, stop doing this, stop building all over the West Bank and all the rest of it. Why do the Israelis not listen more? Why do they not care more about US public opinion?
Well, I think some Israelis do, but I think, as Heather pointed out, Benjamin Netanyahu is the interlocutor for the United States, and he doesn't believe fundamentally in a two-state solution. So you have a fundamental clash of views, and it's been an absolute kind of foundational principle of American foreign policy towards Israel that, the way out of this impasse, the way out of this kind of a nightmare of constantly colliding tectonic plates is a two-state solution. And yet Netanyahu doesn't believe in that. So, there's no way of getting around that. And I think the last few weeks and certainly, the last 24 hours have illustrated just the however much America sees itself as the preeminent diplomatic power in the Middle East, that in some areas it just is not able to use its influence over Netanyahu and the Israeli government. And we've seen that, over, attempts to try and alleviate the humanitarian crisis in Gaza with the invasion of South Lebanon this week, and now its failure to try and de-escalate. So we're seeing, I think, the limits of American influence. That's the core thing, and that's part of, as Heather was alluding to, that's part of a bigger global picture that is the crisis of the 21st century right now.
Okay, let's move on now to our other main talking point this week, the vice presidential debate between Republican J.D. Vance and Democrat Tim Walz. And the topic of who won the last election back in 2020 is still causing some friction.
This was a threat to our democracy in a way that we had not seen. And it manifested itself because of Donald Trump's inability to say. He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future. Did Kamala Harris censor Americans from speaking their mind in the wake of the 2020 COVID situation?
That is a damning non-answer.
It's a damning non-answer for you to not talk about censorship. Obviously, Donald Trump and I think that there were problems in 2020. We've talked about it. I'm happy to talk about it further. Iran, which launched this attack, has received over $100 billion in unfrozen assets thanks to the Kamala Harris administration. What do they use that money for? They use it to buy weapons that they're now launching against our allies and, God forbid, potentially launching against the United States as well.
Iran is closer to a nuclear weapon than they were before because of Donald Trump's fickle leadership. And when Iran shot down an American aircraft in international airspace, Donald Trump tweeted, because that's the standard diplomacy of Donald Trump.
Before we talk about deportations, we have to stop the bleeding. We have a historic immigration crisis because Kamala Harris started and said that she wanted to undo all of Donald Trump's border policies.
Kamala Harris was the Attorney General of the largest state and a border state in California. She's the only person in this race who prosecuted transnational gangs for human trafficking and drug interventions.
It was a more restrained occasion than when Harris and Trump met face-to-face to debate, with Vance and Walz even appearing to agree with each other on some topics. It was lively, nevertheless. I mean, let's talk about the vice presidential debate. And Robert, I'd actually like to come to you first and talk about what Vance had to say about the 2020 election. I know we probably all hate hypotheticals, but I feel like this is a legitimate one. If it had been J.D. Vance instead of Mike Pence last time, do you think the whole question of not certifying the election, perhaps persuading states to send different sets of electors, do you think that realistically might have got further? And if it had, what would have been the consequence for America?
Well, I mean, that is a hypothetical one. I'm not sure, we're able to to answer it, but I mean, I think there's no question that, you know, J.D. Vance last night had a strong debate, but there was that moment at the very end when suddenly, you know, it was almost like he stood there exposed. Was he or was he not a kind of election denialist? And that is a clip that I know that the Harris campaign, as Adam will know better than me, has put out already today as an ad across social media, essentially trying to portray him. Sure, he's a good debater, is the sort of Democratic framing of this, but he's essentially an election denialist. And so that is certainly going to be part of the argument going forward. And he came across as, you know, as a super smart, super sharp debater. I was left with the question is, when I raised this with Adam earlier, was whether, just for the very first time, whether Vice President Harris might have been thinking, gosh, I'd wish I'd picked Governor Josh Shapiro from Pennsylvania instead of Governor Walz, just because Shapiro is sharp and aggressive and might have had a better debate than Walz. But we will see. But J.D. Vance came out of it well. I think, Heather, you feel that strongly,
yeah,
right?
I think he came across as the clear winner, in large part because Americans' expectations of him were so low. And why do I say that? I say because he'd been so demonized, not just in the press, but also by Democrats. So people came in wanting to dislike him, expecting to dislike him. But yet what they saw was a man who has a very basic American story from a life that was raised by a single mom who battled a drug addiction and then taken care of by his grandmother and needed public assistance, and then went on to the GI Bill to become a U.S. Marine and fight for our country in Iraq. So a terrific story, and it was a great way for him to reintroduce himself to the American public after having kind of a rougher rollout. So I think he was the clear winner. He gave specifics. That's one of the things that Americans have become so frustrated with, feeling that the campaigns have not, or at least with Harris's campaign, have not laid out specific policy proposals, and he did just that last night, and I think that was smart and very shrewd of him. Clear winner last night.
Adam, would you acknowledge that J.D. Vance had a pretty good night and Tim Walz had a fairly so-so one?
I'd say Vance had a good 45 minutes. I think the last 45 minutes did not go his way, and that Tim Walz certainly got stronger as the debate went along. And, you know, there was around the moment where they started talking about the issue of reproductive freedom and abortion. That really did seem to upset the ongoing trajectory of the debate. And Walz really got Vance on the back foot, and by talking about this issue in very personal terms. And we've seen this in the first debate, right? In many respects, Kamala Harris flipped the whole debate on its head with her answer and pushing back on Trump on that issue, and carried through. Walz carried that through, and then towards the end of the debate, where after talking about immigration, after talking about the economy, this issue of democracy and January 6th, it really was a disqualifying answer, in my view, from J.D. Vance. And here's why. When the vice president is in the Oval Office with the president, he has to give him his true, unvarnished advice. That is part of the job. If you can't trust the vice president to give the president unvarnished, untrue, just the real, call the balls and strikes, give it to him straight, that calls into question whether he'll be an effective vice president and whether he'll give the president the advice that he should get. And so that's why I think the American people will respond to it. I think that's why the Harris campaign is going to play with it, because it gets to this fundamental question about whether Trump and Vance are fit and should be the next president of the United States.
Every time I listen to a focus group of undecided voters, I feel like I hear the same thing over and over again, which is people saying, yeah, I felt like I was probably better off under Trump, but I don't know. I'm not so sure about him, / he sounds a bit crazy, whatever. By which I mean, generally, I know the polls are suggesting Trump's lead in the economy may be shrinking a bit, but generally there's that feeling maybe they were better off before and that inclines them to Trump. His character maybe inclines them against. So I guess the million-dollar question really finally today to all three of you is, how do you think that battle in undecided voters' minds plays out these last few weeks? And what could or could not influence it? Heather, maybe begin with you.
Yep. So first, the polls are all pretty much within the margin of error. We have to watch those battleground states that we've talked a lot about. One thing we haven't touched on today is the potential impact of Hurricane Helene here. 160 Americans at this point now declared dead, hundreds more still missing. We can't discount the potential impact of that in two key states in North Carolina and Georgia. So I think that is something to watch very closely. As for the rest of the states, all pretty much within the margin of error. This race is going to be tight. And this race is going to be all about the turnout. Now, Harris, of course, is going to be working for the women's vote. Trump and Vance are going to be looking to get out the independent vote and reminding Americans that we were not only better off as an economy, but we were safer as a result, and safer in terms of our border security. And that's an issue that's very important to a lot of Americans, including moms. So I think that message will really resonate. I hope that President Trump gets J.D. Vance out there more. He did a terrific job last night. I'd like to hear a lot more from him.
Adam?
Look, I think that there's no question as we get into the last couple, 35 days of the campaign, you're going to see the Harris campaign just try to get out and use their tremendous grassroots enthusiasm and try to use the resources that they've invested in the states, whether that, across the battleground states where they have a clear advantage in terms of both volunteers, offices around the country that are using within the party their support to try to get voters out. So I think that's going to be a fundamental issue. And I think the fact that Harris has closed the gap on the economy, we've seen polls show it increases to tighten. And now where Harris has pulled ahead in some polls of her on the economy, that's the issue that voters care the most about. If she can play that to a draw or get ahead, I think that will be a huge game changer as we get into the final days of the campaign. Let's not forget, inflation is now down to around the Fed's 2% target. The stock market over 42,000. Jobs, unemployment rate still at a near all-time low. Those are all good things for her to run on in the final days of the campaign.
Robert, final word to you.
Yeah, I mean, I share their view that this is an exceptionally tight election with, 34 days, 33 days to go now. And it is going to come down to those kind of micro demographics, and not just to states, but also to counties. And that's why I was asking Adam about the Arab American voter in the suburbs of Detroit. I'm curious about, white working class men in Western Pennsylvania. Will they be upset with kind of the inconsistencies of the vice president's talk about fracking? And Heather's right to raise this hurricane. Maybe that changes people's perceptions in Western North Carolina or in parts of southern Georgia as well. So, we often talk, as we began this podcast talking about, is the October surprise. We're only at the beginning of October. We've got a month to go. There could be multiple surprises this month. And that, in turn, because of the tightness of this election, could well shape the outcome of who is the next president of the United States.
And then if I can quickly add another surprise we haven't touched on yet, and that is a strike that was announced earlier this week. The longshoremen, a labor union here in the United States, very powerful, in charge of all of our ports along the East Coast from Maine down to Florida. They've shut down. And the Biden administration is unwilling to get in and negotiate and try to get the two sides to come to a deal. The longshoremen want $77 an hour, or 77% rather increase. And that's really untenable for the companies that do that. So I think this could have an impact, a standstill at our ports, not getting goods to Americans on time could be a major issue in this campaign if it ends up playing out and not getting resolved soon.
That is a super point. Is we talk about the literal storm, but there's a kind of the perfect storm politically too, potentially, for Harris, which is chaos on the international stage. We've talked about that. The strike, which could deeply affect supply chains here in the United States, and then all of the domestic issues here about the economy that could in turn change how people vote in these final weeks. And a final thought, of course, is November 5th is election day, but that's the last day of voting. People are already casting their ballots all over some battleground states here in the United States over the next few weeks.
That's just quickly, Tom. I think that's why it's been striking to me to see Trump and President Biden actually have pretty much a similar position on this, the ports and the union negotiating. It's a far cry from the past days where you could see Republicans and Democrats be vastly different on labor issues. I think that will inoculate some of the political upside if this does continue to be an issue. But there's no question this election in many ways is going to be won in the economy. And so the Harris campaign has to hope that in the final days of the campaign, the economy still continues to get back to a healthy, balance, and that's going to be what they hope to ride in for the next 35 days.
Okay. It's so tight, many more discussions for the four of us to have. I'm very pleased to say all of you are going to be with me by my side on election night. Looks like it's going to be a hell of a night. So if you're watching this, please do, or listening, please do join us for Election Night USA here on ITV. Unfortunately, though, that's all we have time for today. But as the countdown continues until Election Day, we'll be posting new episodes for you to watch on ITVX and to listen to on your favorite podcast platform. Do make my day, all of our days, by subscribing. But for now, from all of us here on Talking Politics USA, goodbye, and thank you for joining us.